everyone, this is Kathy Aranzana. Welcome back. Today I'll be doing some Copic coloring using Tiny, Townie, Patricia Loves Pumpkins from Stamping Bella, Fall Halloween Sentiments also from Stamping Bella, and Scallop A2 Honeycuts from Honeybee Stamps. I'll go over how I finally figured out a way to color pleats on a dress, which is what I started with in this video. The first color that I'm using is BG11, and what I'm doing is going in where the pleats would naturally be from how she is perched up on the pumpkin. Next I go in with my darkest color, which is BG57. And I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to the cardstock and doing just tiny little flicks because that's where the darkest parts of those pleats will be. And by the way, I stamped her in Memento Tuxedo Black ink onto 110-pound Solar White Nina cardstock. The next color that I'm using is BG 1515, and I'm extending those pleats up a little bit further into the dress. My lightest color is BG10, and here I'm just going to go over the whole dress to blend out all of those colors. Her dress does have some polka dots on it, and I didn't try and go around the polka dots. I actually colored right through them because I knew that I was going to use a darker color to fill them in. But with Copics being transparent, you can still sort of see the pleats, even though I colored over quite a bit of them. One of the things that I do like to do is go over from and bring pleats down from the top, but that will be a lighter color because they won't be so prominent up towards the top of the bodice of her dress. So I did that there with the BG11. And this is BG49. And I am starting to... Oh, I take that back. That is still BG57. I was just adding in some shadows where there would be like next to her arms and between her arms, how she's leaning forward on the pumpkin. Then I went back in with the BG11 to blend out a little bit of those shadows that I added in. And back in with my lightest color, BG10. And it does take some time and a little bit of patience to just keep kind of going over it. And when you first start doing them, the pleats, they kind of look funny, but don't give up on them. Just keep going until you're happy. I would say the biggest tip that I could give is to go very light when you use the darkest color at the darkest part of those pleats. And here's the BG49 to color in the polka dots on her dress. Back to the pleating. Again, when you do the darkest color, you want to use a very light hand, and instead of blending out with a color below, go with your first mid-tone color to help blend them out a bit. I found that that helped me so that my pleats looked like pleats rather than big dark teardrops at the bottom that looked somewhat out of place. For her collar, I did the BG57 and the BG15. Her collar was so tiny, and that's the thing with this stamp. There are a lot of tiny little bits and pieces to be colored in. So a lot of times I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to the cardstock. BG10 is good for blending out the harsher lines. And moving on to her face and her hands, the colors I used are E53, E51, E50, and R00. And I started here with the E53 just to add some shading, you know, around the hairline, where her hair was going to start to come down on her face. With her hands, I did E53 at the bottom of the cuffs of her sleeves and then all of her little fingers. Going in with E51 to blend out the E53. And I'm still leaving quite a bit of white space on her face just so I can get one more skin tone in there. For her hands, I completed them with the E51 because they would be darker because she's kind of leaning over them. This is the E50 to finish off her face. And then I go in with the R00 and just do tiny little dots to give her a little bit of blush on her cheeks. And there, oh, that was a colorless blender just to clean up a little bit. I went into her sleeves a little bit with the aquas. So in her hair, she has a very cute little sunflower. And some of the petals are pretty tiny, and her hair is curly. So what I did was I went in with Y21 and colored all of the petals of the flower so that I could see where I needed to go in with the shading. I don't really have a normal way of starting with my lightest moving out to my darkest, or starting with the darkest moving out to my lightest. It depends on the image that I'm coloring. For this one in particular, I would start with lighter colors for most of it because some of the bits and pieces were so tiny. I'm adding a little bit of shading here with YR27. And mostly the petals that are sitting behind each other, that's why I would add some shading with that. And the petals that were in the way back, I pretty much colored almost the whole petal in except maybe the very, very tip with the YR27. Next up, I'm going in with YR23 to help blend out the YR27. And that one I did take all the way out to the very edge of the petals. After I was done with those colors, it looked a little bit drab to me. So I took Y08 and went over the whole flower, all of the petals, just to add a little bit of brightness to it. For the flower center, I started with E35. Then I went in with E29, and I just added some dots around the center. And I had to kind of lift it up. My light was in a weird place, so I had to lift it up to see what I was doing there. Once I was happy with all the little dots, I went in with an E33 and just lightly blended them out a little bit. I didn't want the center of the flower to look like the same color of her hair, so that's why I went with more earthy tones. With her hair, I started with E34, and I took that other cap off because I just refilled my marker and I was noticing that it was starting to pool. So if you find that you're coloring and your markers suddenly want to drop a big blob of ink, take off that other marker, the other end, the cap on the other end, and that will keep it from pooling. So I went in with the E34 and just laid down a little bit of color where I was going to have to put some shadows in using the darkest color, which is E79. That's what I'm doing here. I'm going in where there would be the most shadows, so under the flower. And then I did a few squiggles on the top by her bangs and then down by the side of her face. Now I'm using E37 to kind of blend some of that E79 out a little bit, you'll notice that there are some white spaces there, and those are done on purpose. I'll go in with the E34 to blend it all together, and it just gives it a more natural looking highlight when you have some white spaces left to fill in with the lightest color. For the sleeves and her stockings, I did them the same way. I used cool grays. I started with C7, and since my light source is on the right hand side, I colored the left side of the sleeves barely, just a tiny little dot almost with the C7. Then I went in with the C5 and blended out the C7. And with the C3, I just went down the whole sleeve just to fill in the rest of those spaces. For the button on her, at the top of her collar there, I used YR23, and then I went over it with Y21 just to lighten it up a bit. In here I'm starting on the pumpkin, and for the pumpkin I'm starting with YR27, and I'm just adding in where the cast shadows would be, where the darkest parts would be. With this, again, I just used a very, very light hand, went along the lines of the pumpkin, and I did tiny little flicks underneath the ruffle on her dress, because, of course, her dress would be casting a shadow on the face of the pumpkin there. And with her stockings, I didn't show that in the video. I actually cut that out because otherwise this video was going to be really long, and it's already pretty long. And the coloring is sped up a little bit, not too much. But I did her stockings the same way that I did her sleeves. Back to the pumpkin. I'm adding shading down at the bottom right there where the leaves would be casting a shadow up on top, up the pumpkin, because of where the light source is off to the right hand side there. And it's always best to start light-handed with the dark color. You can always go back in, and this is one of those instances where I actually did start with my darkest color. And you can see I'm just doing tiny little flicks here and there, just a little bit. And the flicks go up a little bit further on the left hand side because it's going to be darker over there simply because of the light source. The next color that I used is YR15, and I brought that color down a little bit further than the first color, the YR27. And for me to do a flicking motion, it's easier for me to bring it towards myself rather than try to flick away. I used to try to flick away from myself, and that I got very weird strokes that way. So I read something somewhere that if you are left-handed, try to flick towards your body instead. For some reason it worked better for me, so I was kind of happy about that. And you'll see there I left a really good amount of white space there, and the reason I did that was for my highlight, to maintain a highlight in that center, along the center of that pumpkin. And by doing that, it also helps the pumpkin look more round. So this color is my lightest color, which is YR12, And this is where I'm going to be filling in all of that white space. And I do go all the way into the darker colors just to help blend those out a little bit. All of the colors that I used, I will list them on my blog as to like what colors exactly I used for the dress, the pumpkin, her hair, all of that. So take a moment and you can hop over there to see all of the colors that I used. I wanted my pumpkin to have a little bit more orange in there, so I went in with YR68, and I used this one with a pretty light hand as well. I didn't want to overtake the pumpkin with that color, and I did want to leave that center pretty light so that I could have that nice highlight to make it nice and round. And then I went back in with the YR12 just to blend it out and get those colors working together. And I forgot to add a little shadow by her foot there, so I went back in with the YR68 just to add a little bit more of a shadow from her foot hanging down. Now on the ruffle of her dress, I used C1 up along the hem of the dress. Then I went over all of that with the BG quadruple 0. I wanted the ruffle to have some color, but I did want there to be some shadow. So the C1 created the shadow, and the BG quadruple 0 going over even the C1 just added that tiny little bit of color to the ruffle so it wasn't white. Now for the leaves, I started with YR24, and I didn't really pay much attention to the shape of the leaves as much as I did where the leaves were. The leaves that were closest to the pumpkin, I wanted them to have a little bit more green in them because I didn't want them just to fade into the pumpkin and look like they were part of the pumpkin. So you'll see the leaves up at the top there. I did a little bit more of the YR24. The next color I went in with is YG91, which was the first green. And if I could do this over again, I think I would have used brighter greens, more so than the olivey colors, because the leaves ended up being a little bit too dark, but they're okay, they're fall. And I started with the YG91, I started to actually blend out some of the YR24. And I did more YG91 at the top of the leaves that are at the base of the pumpkin. And there are two tiny leaves that are actually on the pumpkin, and I didn't add any of the yellows or oranges to those leaves. I just did those all green. Next color is YG95, and that was mostly to add a little bit of shading like at the base of the leaves where the stems would be. And the leaves that are very close to the sunflower in her hair, I also did those pretty much all green, very little YR24. And I did a lot more of the YG95 again on those leaves at the bottom, just so that they would definitely be separate from the pumpkin. And I did use the YG95 to color in all the little vines that the leaves are attached to. To blend all of those colors in, I used E34 to blend them. I was hoping for an earthy tone. I probably should have used Y21 or maybe YR21 to give it a more gold look rather than a brown look. So I think, yeah, that would be the other thing. For if I could do this over, the one thing I would change would be the greens on the leaves. I would have used brighter ones, and then to blend the colors together, I would have used maybe Y21 or YR21. But again, they came out kind of brownish, and so they're kind of fall-ish leaves. And then I decided that I had to go back in with some green there because that leaf got lost up against the pumpkin. And so did that one. That is one nice thing about the Copics, though, is that you can keep going over to add more color or blend more colors if you need to. Now, to ground the pumpkin, I decided to use E43, E42, and E41. I started with E43, which is the darkest, and put that right underneath the pumpkin, because that's where the darkest shadow would be. And I kind of flicked it out towards the bottom a little bit. And then I went in with the E42. And I just kind of worked my way around the bottom and blended out that E43 a little bit. And then I noticed that my ground looks a little bit crooked. So I come back in with the E43 just to straighten it out a little bit, have a little bit, just to add that grounding line so it looks more like it's a little bit further back. Right there is where I did the E43. Then I thought over by the pumpkin it wasn't dark enough. I had blended it out too much with the 42, so I went back over it with the 43. And then I go back right over it again, so with the 42, so it gets a little bit lighter. And finally the E41, just to finish off the bottom piece there, and just to kind of soften some of those lines, just to blend those colors together a little bit better. I did end up cutting this panel down to fit inside the scalloped rectangle honeycut from Honeybee Stamps, which I knew that I was going to do that. So I did end up losing some of those leaves and a little bit of the ground, but it worked out just fine. And to get rid of all the white above her, I used Tumbled Glass Distress ink with just a regular stamping sponge, and very lightly went over it. And I wasn't too worried about going over the pumpkin or her hair because it's such a light blue. I was pretty careful going around her face though, because I didn't want her to have blue freckles. I stamped the sentiment from the set using archival ink in coffee. I stamped it twice, but I really didn't need to stamp it twice. It stamped the first time quite nicely. And here I am putting the card together with some music attached for you. Thank you so much for stopping by and tuning in today. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and you can see all of the products listed over on my blog, and that is linked below as well. Thanks again, and see you next time.